newspaper headlines. As a side note, the presentation slides will be made available on the Humanities Center website. As an introduction, President Obama signed the Affordable Care Act introducing new health care reforms on March 23rd, 2010. The Affordable Care Act has produced major changes in how millions of Americans are getting health insurance and ushered in widespread health care reforms. On this slide, you can see President Obama signing the Affordable Care Act. Beginning on October 1st, 2013, U.S. citizens could sign up for health insurance coverage through the health insurance marketplace. The health insurance marketplace is commonly referred to as the healthcare.gov website. It is a critical component of the Affordable Care Act law. This is an important vehicle through which individuals can go online and sign up for health care plans. And an estimated 7 to 8 million have signed up. So the healthcare.gov website was a critical component of the Affordable Care Act law. It's important to note, too, that research has shown that the general public obtains much of its information about health issues, but also health policy matters through the news media. And here is a shot of the healthcare.gov website. And again, this is an important vehicle through which individuals could go online and sign up for health care plans. Examining newspaper coverage of health topics is useful for a number of reasons. We can begin to understand how the news media both communicates and frames important health issues to the general public. Framing refers to a process where the media selects certain aspects, making these aspects more salient than others. And this can have an influence on audiences, public perceptions, and interpretations of these health topics. The concept of framing draws attention to how communicated text exerts its power by shaping the discourse over an issue. Dominant frames used early in the news coverage can influence audiences and can create an impression that is difficult to change. Therefore, studies that are guided by the theory of framing are helpful to illuminate the ways in which dominant frames are portraying important health topics, especially health topics that have significant social and political interests, such as the Affordable Care Act and more broadly healthcare reform. While a number of studies have examined the media framing of particular health issues, studies examining the Affordable Care Act, how the Affordable Care Act are being portrayed in the news are lacking. Therefore, the purpose of this study was to extend the existing literature to investigate how the news media is portraying the Affordable Care Act. The objectives of the present study were to examine the volume and frequency of news coverage about the Affordable Care Act across 6 major newspapers in the United States. Another objective was to identify dominant terms used in the newspaper headlines about the Affordable Care Act. Another objective was to determine if the language used to characterize the Affordable Care Act changed over time in the news. To provide some additional context, several studies have examined the media framing of particular health issues. One study looked at obesity, and another study examined type 2 diabetes. Another study also found that alarming messages were portrayed, and they were actually dominant early on in the news media in the 2009 flu epidemic. Now recall that dominant messages early in the news can create an impression that may be difficult to change. However, to date, no studies have examined the media framing of the Affordable Care Act and issues surrounding the healthcare.gov website. Therefore, an investigation to better understand how the Affordable Care Act and more broadly healthcare reform are being portrayed in the news are both timely and warranted. And with this, I will turn it over to Sandra. Yes.
Okay. In describing our method for constructing our sample, We focused on the analysis of newspaper articles which reference the Affordable Care Act and utilized the time frame of October the 1st, 2013, which is when the sign-ups for healthcare.gov began, through April 30th, 2014, which is 1 month after the deadline for sign-ups. Using the keywords Affordable Care Act website, Obamacare website, and healthcare.gov, newspaper articles were identified and downloaded from the 6 newspapers using the ProQuest newspaper database. And those 6 newspapers were the Washington Post, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, and the Detroit Free Press. And by using those keyword search for those 6 major newspapers, the research generated 584 newspaper articles. And after removing the duplicates, which were total 218, we came up with a sample of 366 newspaper articles that we reviewed. Our data collection and analysis was done in 2 phases. In phase 1, we imported the information about the newspaper articles into an Excel spreadsheet, and we examined the frequency and distribution of the articles, and we looked at the title of the articles, the dates, the newspapers, the authors, etc. Again, we removed all the duplicates. In phase 2, the research team decided on focus coding and analysis of the titles of the newspaper articles. And in support of this approach, research by Vasterman and Rugroke state that the news headlines grasp what the reporter defines as the most newsworthy aspect of the story, and it is acceptable to analyze these instead of the whole article. And as part of our data collection and analysis process, each newspaper headline was coded and analyzed for phrases used to characterize the Affordable Care Act website. In this process, Dr. Hankin, Dr. Charbonneau, and myself independently coded all of the titles of the 366 headlines. We then came together and collectively analyzed the titles of the headlines, and our team discussed our findings and achieved consensus on the coding, and thereby incorporating inter-rater reliability into our findings. We also found that some article headlines were compounded with 2 or more titles, and in order to be consistent in our coding, we developed rules to help guide us in the process, in our coding process. And in particular, we decided to code only the first portion of those compounded headlines. And I'll show you an example of the compounded headlines in just a minute. Again, we came up with a total of 366 newspaper headlines that we analyzed and coded. I know this is small print, but this table provides some examples of the Affordable Care Act headlines from the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, the Detroit Free Press, and the Chicago Tribune. And it also shows you what our codes were in the last column that we came up with. Article number 5 from the top and the last one are examples of compound headlines, where you have a headline and then maybe a dash or a semicolon and more information, which shows that we needed some direction on how to code these. So we only coded the first part of the headline. Now this table shows that the frequency of articles about the Affordable Care Act, and take a look at the total, they were highest in October, November, and December. And as the healthcare.gov website was fixed and repaired, the glitches were addressed, and the technological difficulties were resolved, the frequency of articles referencing the ACA declined over time. And as you can see, the Washington Post had the most articles, followed by the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And these are national newspapers with higher readership compared to the regional newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, and Detroit Free Press. And overall, you can see that the same pattern and frequency over time is shown for all of the newspapers. And that same pattern over time is shown in this graph using the data from the previous slide. As you can see, the first three newspapers, Washington Post, New York Times, followed by the Wall Street Journal, had the most articles, 141, 72, and 61 respectively, followed by the regional newspapers, Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, Detroit Free Press, which had 53, 29, and 10 respectively. And again, the same pattern over time is shown for all newspapers, namely a stark decrease in January and a leveling off of newspaper articles that reference the ACA website thereafter. In addition, from our analysis of the 366 newspaper headlines, we identified, as shown in this table, the top 15 descriptive words in the ACA headlines, appearing in the headlines, as well as the number of times that these words occurred in the headlines. And the four runners were enroll, deadline, fix, problem, glitch, rollout, and trouble, followed by woe, flaw, error, delay, launch, slow, long, and coming in at number 15, snag. Now this table shows a shift in the descriptive words identified in the headlines over time. Specifically in October, the emphasis was on fix, problem, and glitch. And in November, the emphasis also was on fix and problem, but it also included enrollment. And in December, the emphasis was on enrollment and deadline. And those were the two that occurred the most. As you can see, the highest frequency of the descriptive words occurred mainly in October, November, and December, and then again peaking in March with the word deadline. This is most likely because of the approaching March 31st deadline for individuals to sign up for the health insurance on healthcare.gov. And Dr. Hankin.
Thank you. In a baseball analogy, I get to be the closer. So what have we found? Well, one of the first findings is that the volume and frequency certainly varied over time. There were ebbs and flows. In October through December of 2013, we had many articles talking about healthcare.gov website. Then it tailed off in 2014. A second important finding is that dominant terms in the very beginning, that is in especially October and November, were things like enrollment and problems. Deadline peaked both in December and in March. I mean, March was the final deadline to enroll on the website. It's very clear that descriptive words were much more alarming in the first 3 months of publications. The notion of framing is a process where media selects certain aspects of the website and made it more salient. This impacts how we, the audience, view and interpret these developments. To frame means to select. It highlights bits of information, not the whole story, but just bits of it. And it promotes a particular version of reality. So the framing we saw used dominant terms or phrases, words of urgency, to create a sense of anxiety in the public, escalating concerns, and the notion that this has got to be fixed. The alarming portrayals of the Affordable Care Act website came early on. There were very few positive portrayals, in other words, what we might call counter-framing. So we saw not very many articles about progress or success. These positive terms were not in our top 15 or even in the top 10. It's interesting that the moral panic theory may be applicable to what we're seeing. A moral panic is defined as an episode often triggered by alarming media stories and reinforced by reactive laws and public policy of exaggerated or misdirected public concern, anxiety, fear, or anger over a perceived threat to social order. The moral panic that emerged said, this website isn't working, people are not going to be able to sign up, we should fire Sebelius, and Sebelius eventually resigned in April. But all this tumult was being fanned by the press. Some examples of the urgent phrases and headlines include Sebelius' statement on October 3rd, 2013, that appeared in the New York Times headline. Sebelius apologizes for debacle. So that's how we got the title of this talk. Health Secretary vows to fix Obamacare website's problems and says Americans deserve better. If you see, there's a definite trend. These are listed, you can't see the month necessarily on the slide, but these are listed in terms of when the headline appeared. So the first entry on this slide is 10/25. The last entry on this one is 12/1. So you see botched launch. Problems have crippled. How to start up a fail to launch. Then a more positive note, despite a botched rollout, and this was in November, the healthcare law is worth it. Also in November, healthcare enrollment rises sharply despite problems, which is again more positive. The Washington Post had a headline for uninsured how and when to get enrolled, and the Los Angeles Times had an entry on December 1st of the health website Healing, Not Cured. So there's both a positive and negative on that, which were coded as neutral. Again, later on, starting on December 2nd, we've got progress in the first one, errors, which is negative in the second one, deadline looms, which is negative, and December 14th, errors continue to plague health site. In January, we get success story with the notion that there needs extra help to sign up. On the 26th of February, we see sign up under health law hit 4 million, which is positive. And the last one we're showing you from towards the end of March, another healthcare.gov obstacle looms for some. It's important to acknowledge the limitations of our study. First of all, we searched only 6 United States newspapers. We focused on the first sign-up period. We noticed, as we did this coding, that the headlines did not necessarily reflect the sentiment of the whole article. We didn't look at other print or media portrayals, so we didn't look at television, radio, blogs, or online publications. All right, the next stage of our research is to focus on the entire article and its content and code that. We'll code whether or not certain experts were cited. Was it President Obama? Was it Sebelius? Was it an IT person? We'll also analyze whether or not a balanced picture is being shown. We'll take a look at whether personal stories are told. So are they interviewing people who succeeded on the website or who failed on the website? Additional research that examines any impact of the media framing on the Affordable Care Act would certainly, on public perceptions, would certainly be helpful. The second enrollment starts November 15th, and the publicity that's been shared at this point is that healthcare.gov is better, it's shorter, and it's a simpler application form. And they're hoping that that will help. So in summary, this is the first study to look at how 6 major newspapers portray the healthcare.gov website. These findings have practical implications for health communication, education, and policy. In other words, what do we have to do to help people get onto the website and to sign up for health insurance? what communications work, what education programs work, who should be teaching people what to do. There were a number of health insurance navigators in various states who actually had prospective enrollees come in and helped walk them through the process. Healthcare providers can also work with news media to provide accurate information. There were, lots of stories in the very beginning that, well, nobody's signing up at all, that the website is totally worthless, etc., and that wasn't true. The bottom line is that the dominant frame that we found in the headlines was a negative one, with very alarming language early in the news coverage. With that, we'd be delighted to get your comments or answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
I'm just curious, how do you define the duplicate newspaper articles?
How do we define
The duplicate.
the duplicates? There were many articles that, for instance, may have started off in the Washington Post but were picked up by the Free Press or the Los Angeles Times, and it was the same article by the same person with the exact same words. So we took those out.
I can just add, hi Dr. Lee, that I deduped them in the database, so that was a manual, that was a technical sort of thing, but then we actually had to manually exclude them based on what Dr. Hankin just described, so it was a two-step process.
All right.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your presentation. I think it was yesterday, the Pew Research Center did a poll on where people get their news from. And in their study, they found that 47% of Republicans get the news from one source, and that's Fox News. Democrats are pretty much just all over the place. Whether they get in this, like New York Times, Washington Post, it's kind of scattered. I didn't see the numbers on the Independents. But this makes me think, though, in terms of the news source, in terms of, because of that idea is that, how these stories are covered may have an impact on people who view the issue. That I know that you guys were looking at, it seemed like print newspapers, but I was just wondering, to me it's interesting to look at, so if you look at like Fox News, I know they don't have a newspaper, but they have an online site, and they have articles on the online site, which has a strong Republican bias, and then you have MSNBC, or any of those newspapers you put up there right now, maybe Independent or Democrat. And then you have, and again, some of these don't have print publications, but media that is not supported by corporate sponsors. So you got, I was watching now, and so you're looking at kind of the three different types of media sources. So one is strong Republican bias, one is kind of Democratic leaning, the other is non-corporate funded. How does discussion of these issues, how much is it discussed, and then how does it change over time based upon basically the audience that they're catering?
Certainly the Wall Street Journal is very conservative and leans Republican, and when we started looking at those articles, we see a different tone than what we see in the New York Times and the Washington Post. The Washington Post articles tend to be far more politically based, talking about how Congress people and officials tell the story. And so as we analyze who are the experts, we have a hunch, and we'll have to see whether or not it happens or not, that the newspapers themselves will cite different people and will make draw different conclusions. But I mean, that is a really good point to look at. Thank you. Heather.
Well, this is a follow-up to that. It sounded like you did searches for the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and healthcare.gov. Different articles pop up depending on which words you used, or did more from one newspaper versus the other pop up depending on the actual search phrase?
We combined the searches, but we can go back and separate them, but we were trying to get a total sample. So we can look at because obviously Obamacare is a loaded term, it would be interesting to track
when that came into, that actual phrase became adopted. So I think we could do some more work with that as well. But the table in the analysis we have was a combined search of all of them. So, but thanks for mentioning it.
Yeah, it might be interesting to see if the bot that the error words come up under healthcare.gov versus,
They go on there.
yeah.
Right. Anybody else? John?
Do you intend to juxtapose these data against public opinion, poll data on Obamacare?
If we can get time points that match our time frame, we could do that. I'm not sure that they did monthly polls over time, but that's certainly something to check into to see how, whether or not it seemed to be related to how the headlines were going. Yeah, frequent polling isn't, on this issue has not been real common, but we can dig deep and see what we can find. That's a good suggestion.
Off the top of my head, I would think that Gallup poll, Pew Research Center, they also have a division that looks at media research as well. So they also look at, headlines they look at problems of headlines, problems of stories. And they also, of course, have public opinion data as well. So,
Great, thank you.
Couple of comments. The first is that I don't think this is the direction you're going now, but I was thinking about just the headlines, and if we have any information about the extent to which that headline is just taken and run with by different types of new media, because what strikes me with new media is that there is such an emphasis on the pithy something, and maybe those headlines are actually more universal than just newspaper headlines.
That's a good question. Do you have another?
Well, I just was also thinking about the point at which I remember President Obama owning Obamacare,
Right.
the phrase,
Right.
and thinking that prior to that, my sense was that, people who used Obamacare had something negative to say. And people who talked not just of Affordable Care Act, but I think at that stage we didn't yet have a pithy little way to capture it. We were talking about the patient protections and healthcare affordability act,
Right.
which kind of long phrase. So I just figured.
And my recollection is that he picked it up during his last presidential campaign, but that would be a really good thing to look at. That he started owning it then as a positive rather than a negative.
And my third comment is that I heard some political ads, not recently, because I think maybe the Obamacare act is not as effective as some people thought it would be. But I always hear this tone in one of the earlier ads, where when the person says Obamacare, they have such a derisive tone to the word. Now this, of course, is audio, not visual, but I always wonder if one were to analyze messages that are coming through hearing, and you knew how to analyze tone. It's just very obvious in one of the ads. The person gets Obamacare, so like everyone knows that's a terrible thing. So I think there would be several programs of research here.
Great.
I think this research could have a lot of longevity, especially if you were to go back to the online news media outlets and even look at the comments from all of the users. I mean, that in and of itself could be an interesting project. So I think there are a lot of directions it could unfold and go.
David?
Yeah, I think my question would be if what you're finding here was actually even more negative than prior. So I think what might be really interesting is if you sort of looked at sort of these different eras of the healthcare reform, so sort of when it was first suggested, I don't remember the years, and then you had that summer where they were having all the protests and the town hall meetings, and then sort of looking, okay, now when they actually passed it, right, to see how it ebbed and flowed, because you might actually find this was more positive than, particularly during that summer, when they really had the organized opposition, those huge protests, they were going to all the town hall meetings, and it just seemed like a barrage of sort of negativity surrounding it. So it might sort of be interesting to compare how the headlines, how it was framed in sort of these different eras, when it was just an idea, to when it was really hotly contested, when it was passed, and then by the time the website was opening, the temperature had sort of gone down a little bit to some degree.
Mhm. Right. Other comments or suggestions? We're open to all ideas. John?
I have a question. You talked about moral panic theory, and I was thinking about this first when you said that. I immediately thought of Ebola,
Right.
and I thought, wow, that's like deep panic thing. And I wondered if when Obamacare first started, it was framed as a problem, and because I thought of the death panels when I first heard of this, and the whole idea of what was, that sort of like was framing the issue and sort of defining and making it like a problem already. It was already like in public discussion. So how does the idea of media creating panic already when there isn't like a public debate, because it's such a politicized discussion already? I don't know if I'm coming across.
I mean, one of the things we wondered is that whether some of these words suggested to people that it was going to be impossible for them to sign up on the website, and therefore it pushed people away. Yet on the other hand, 7 to 8 million people have already enrolled, and so they persevered, or basically said, we're not going to listen to all the media hype on how difficult that is. It'll be especially interesting to see under this new rollout, where you only have to go through 3 screens instead of about 20, what impact that's going to make and how the press portrays the new sign-up time period.
So what you're saying is that the use of the website is what created the whole image.
Well, that's what we were studying. We were looking specifically at the website rather than the ACA Act, and we were looking at how the website per se was portrayed in the media. So we really narrowed our search to what was happening with descriptions of the website and the problems with the website. And, the vitriol from some people is really pretty severe if you read the entirety of some of these articles. So we're anxious to start coding those kinds of details.
So I guess that I just say what I thought, because you mentioned about moral panic, I immediately thought the idea of the media generating panic based on what they were reporting about the website.
Right, exactly. And panicking people that don't even try to go on, it's too crowded, you're not going to be able to get through the process, you're not going to be able to get your health care insurance, you're going to be taxed heavily if you don't do this, those kinds of messages. So we thought to make it manageable, we would just focus on the website problems per se, because that was something that was very definable. And it was a particular defined period of time. It started October 1st. They extended the enrollment, but the enrollment ended the 31st of March. Now it's going to start up again. So it'll be interesting to track what's going on with the new website and whether people are experiencing such difficulties. But, the bottom line, nonetheless, 7 to 8 million people were able to get on and get their health insurance.
Why do you suppose journalists in particular set such an exceptionally high bar for governmental performance?
I don't know.
It could have been another narrative. It could have been, look at these private contractors and the opportunism that they've engaged in. The fault is with the private sector, not government.
And they didn't frame it that way, it's very clear.
Why not?
Well, because they wanted to go after Obama. That was how they were framing it.
So it was political.
Oh, very political, I think. And I think we'll see that when we, go in depth into the particular text of the articles. That we'll see, they were certainly negative towards the Obama administration, and they didn't want to blame the private sector. But that's a really interesting observation.
It'll be interesting when we look at this expert sources being cited. I think we'll start to get a better sense of issues of power and privilege, who's being cited, what voices were missing. We'll get a better sense of that.
In terms of analyzing the whole article,
Right.
I don't know if you mentioned this, that keeping track of where in the article the information is. I think I heard, I'd like to listen to those on the media type programs on Sunday in terms of the media trying to examine itself.
Right.
And it seems like I do remember one discussion of Obamacare articles that indicated that sometimes the other point of view or some important information was included, but you had to read all the way to the bottom
Right.
of the paper and not everybody, or the article, not everybody does.
And the way they frame the article, the most important message is usually in the first paragraph, and that's the way they set it up. So any information that would be contrary to that first paragraph is going to appear at the very bottom of the article, and that's something really important we need to look at. Thank you. Any other comments or suggestions?
Still a sort of journalistic, ethical lesson to be learned. I mean, my sense when looking at the material presented was that there was this negativity against the Affordable Care Act. But as I saw that as the website became better organized, as people began to get on it, I saw that the reporting became less negative and even became positive. So even though I'm prepared to say that these people were only after Obama, yet the fact that as time went on and the website became, the problems were fixed, I saw that it became more and more positive. And so I'm looking for some ethical or general principle to be captured from a journalistic standpoint out of that.
That's a really
Don't know if
interesting.
it's a sociological
Right.
or a psychological principle that
Well,
I
it's kind of
find
changing.
missing.
Yeah, it's kind of changing the definition of the situation. So in the beginning, they were very much focused on the errors and the problems, which meant that they could get people anxious and riled up and anti-Obamacare. And once it got fixed, if you look at the flow of the articles, it really dropped because they didn't think it was newsworthy. They didn't think it was important to report that 7 to 8 million people had actually signed up. So, I think politics drove a lot of the way the articles appeared.
I mean, is that political or if as the website got fixed, the coverage was more positive, but there also was many fewer articles on it at all. So it seems, based on what you said, that the media is interested, which makes sense, in talking about problems.
Right.
If you're riled up and when the problem goes away, then nothing more to talk about.
Right.
So, is that, because, to me, those newspapers that you have up there, to me, all kind of seem middle of the road, mainstream newspapers. So is it anti-Obama, or is it just that there's nothing to tell because it's working, so we don't tell, nice, happy stories. We want to get people to read the newspaper and buy the stuff on the commercials when they read newspapers. So, I guess the issue is it anti-Obama, or is it there's no more problems and there's no more story?
Or it's just harder to place blame.
Right.
Because the actual problem is harder to track and grow up.
So we can at least say that what appeared in the headline shifted from problems with the website to more of a focus on the deadlines. We can at least say that.
But there's less
because-
stories though. I mean, it'd
Right.
be one thing if it shifted and then the coverage stayed the same, but the coverage just dropped off the table pretty much after.
Right.
Well, there were news peaks, definitely news. You look at the news flow. There were news peaks, and you can coincides with the different events that were occurring in the whole Affordable Care Act timeline. You can sort of map them out.
Well, I was just listening to a discussion about one of the elections in another state, and Obamacare was part of the election debate, and I thought, is this issue because it's being pushed, it becomes such a political, I don't know what the word is, that perhaps that when the press was going on, that the framing of the issue, I guess, made it more overtly political than just simply we have problems here. And this, maybe we made it a political problem rather than just
I mean, certainly some of the ads, even in Michigan, are saying, if elected, I will abolish Obamacare. That's what Terry Lynn Land says. So, there are some of those kinds of reactions that are going on now. But, it'll be interesting to see what kinds of topics are included in the articles, whether they talk about Obamacare in general, or whether they're really just focused on the website in terms of the articles that we were able to find. And again, how this is framed is, do we find that everything that says, enrollment is growing is way down in the last sentence, so most people don't read it. We don't know that yet. We haven't started that level of the analysis, but we thought it'd be really good just to start with, what do the headlines say? Because that's the first thing that people read.
At the beginning of the presentation, where there's this idea that the way something's framed initially may be very difficult to overcome.
Right.
It did just make me wonder about media framing theories. I mean, are there, because part of me is thinking that I sometimes hear and just accept it without examining, that in America we like these stories where somehow you overcome a disaster. So I just wondered, is it true, or could it even be an advantage? I would rather that Obamacare had rolled out differently, but I just was wondering about theory and research on that idea. How much support is there for the idea that an initial negative framing or problematic framing, is it hard to overcome just for a while, but then you could have a wonderful trajectory because you're heroic in your overcoming? Or is it sort of just, you're just always fighting it for the whole time? It's just really damaging to get a bad start.
That's an important question. And, we don't have the answer yet, but certainly as we get into the text per se, we'll have a better sense of, whether there are more positive things and heroic kinds of characterizations as time goes on and as the website gets fixed. John?
I'm discouraging research in political science that shows that partisanship so clouds judgment that reason is nearly impossible, that furnishing people with facts, the line is going up, and a person will literally say, no, it's not. It's astonishing how the views of people are fixed in stone after the initial narrative gets established and set. So it may be that the good news about Obamacare, just especially for Republicans, just doesn't stick at all.
Right. I suspect that may be happening.
Well, I was trying to be hopeful.
Questions?